Okay, everybody, starting the recording. Looks like we have a number of latecomers today. We are talking about CloudSecure and really our partner-to-partner ecosystem from a first distribution perspective, in this case powered by AVeS. AVeS is well known for their security offerings, and throughout the capability or the offer in CloudSecure, we've made provision for a couple of solutions, and I will let the team from CloudSecure facilitate this conversation today. I have started the recording, and we will submit that afterwards.
Thanks, Natasha. Am I good to take over from here?
You are absolutely welcome.
All right, fantastic. Thanks. Right, cool. So thank you very much for the time today. My name is Bradley Adams, and I'm the Infrastructure Sales Director down here at AVeS Cyber Security. As Natasha mentioned, we've done a lot of efforts, and we put a lot of time into putting through some co-sell opportunities, specifically white labeled, that hopefully you can take into your supplier database or into your end clients and add a little bit more security into the cloud stack that you guys are currently selling and developing. So please feel free to distribute this presentation, or alternatively get hold of Natasha and myself post-presentation so that we can maybe sit together and work out a proactive sales approach for these into your clients, which is ultimately going to just add a little bit more security into their actual workspace. So before I jump into it, we have got a few other options that we have put together, a few other offerings. And I think a few other offerings that we put together, one has been based on a security assessment, so an ISO 27001 platform. We have another one based on AD on Azure, which I'm going to be presenting today, as well as the security hardening and Microsoft Office 365 presentations. So when we look into it, just give me 2 seconds.
Seems like we're having some technical difficulties. Let's just give Bradley a moment.
Sorry about that. I'm just struggling with something on this side. So when we take a look at the world that we're living in today, 90% of our clients, and a lot of the clients that we're actually onboarding, are clients that are living in a cloud world or are rapidly adapting into a cloud world. And it's our and we have to ask ourselves,
Hi, Bradley. Is everything okay? Sorry, guys. It looks like we're having some trouble on that side of the network. Okay, I'm introducing you to Chandray. Chandray is going to facilitate the rest of the presentation.
Hi, everyone. All right, fantastic. So when looking at Azure Active Directory, I think one of the biggest questions is, first of all, what is Azure Active Directory? How is it different to an on-premise Active Directory environment? And what are the benefits of it? So if we look at traditional on-site or on-premise Active Directory, and I think it served well as a directory services for what it was and what it has been up until now. And I think some of the limitations to it are things like monitoring and management of user identity and access management. But then additionally to that, and probably most importantly, is how do we get reporting out of that? And I think that's obviously where Azure Active Directory plays an important role, is to understand that how do we leverage the distributed access layer through Azure Active Directory? So how do we take an on-premise Active Directory environment federated with Azure Active Directory, and then how do we leverage the advanced reporting and monitoring and tracking of user activity across the platform to give us an overview of identity and access management usage and tracking of that between on-premise Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. So when we speak to our clients, it's to understand that, is this a new adoption that they're taking, or is this a cloud-only adoption, or is it going to be a federated model between on-premise environments and then obviously in cloud Active Directory? And then again, what are the risks of moving to cloud, or to moving to Azure or Azure Active Directory? And then obviously when looking at cloud computing, we have to understand that we're actually talking about a distributed access layer, meaning that data cannot just be the single point of access, and that controlling to the access to data is the part we really need to be focusing. So throughout the different webinars and presentations that we've done on this security offering, I think we've touched on 3 points of entry, or 3 points that need to be secured. So it's essentially the platform that hosts the data, and that may be your Azure, it could be Office 365, it could be Google, it could be Amazon, whatever cloud-based environment it may be, or cloud platform. So it's how do we secure that underlying platform first of all? How do we then secure how access to data that resides on that platform is controlled? And that'll be through mechanisms like Azure Active Directory, RBAC models, so role-based administration models. And then how do we protect the actual data itself and classification of that data itself? And that's where Azure Active Directory plays a big role. So also understand that cloud has removed all these, if you want to really refer to them, onion layers, or layers within an onion that put the primary authentication across a simple username and password. And this is where true security concerns come out or come to the forefront. And then understanding that true or basic and blank passwords aren't enough. So what other mechanisms are there to increase user and identity access management on top of that? So certain things that come to mind are things like multi-factor authentication, essentially, where I try to log into any cloud-based service, leveraging my Azure Active Directory directory services. And then what happens from there? A user has to be authenticated on a different level. So whether they get a notification for a OTP, essentially, either on their mobile device, through their email, or obviously through the Microsoft Authenticator app. That's one of the first and most low-hanging fruit options to secure identity and access management on another layer. So that essentially covers the approach to security and access. Then if we look at local integration of services, so this is essentially, quite simply put, how do we take our on-premise Active Directory environment, how do we federate that to Azure Active Directory, and specifically for the scenario where we have a customer that is running a hybrid environment. So, and it's quite interesting that most customers today, and even across the globe, specifically even in well-developed countries such as the United States, where there are almost no customers, and definitely not any customers of medium to large scale, that have completely moved to a cloud-based environment exclusively. And for this reason, it's very important to be able to create a bridge from an on-premise Active Directory environment to Azure Active Directory with the federation model in mind, and then doing some sort of a directory sync where we can synchronize our identities from our local on-premise environments into our Azure Active Directory, and use that as the facilitator for all future identity and access management, regardless of whether it's on premises or within the cloud. All right, so if we look at what is AAD, so simply put, it's just a mechanism of providing identities to cloud-based application for you and your users. So if you have a look at the diagram on the slide now, you'll see on the left-hand side, we have our on-premise Active Directory environment. So that's traditional AD as we know it. And on the right-hand side, we have the cloud. And then the little arrow that joins the two of them essentially is Azure Active Directory Connect, which is the tool that facilitates exactly what I just spoke about. So first of all, the directory synchronization, synchronizing identities from our on-prem Active Directory into Azure Active Directory, and then also doing the process of single sign-on and federation through that as well. And then at the bottom over there, we have user and devices, and those are essentially access to the data that I spoke about. And you'll see in that cloud picture, and this part is quite important, is that Azure Active Directory and the implementation thereof for identity and access management is not limited to Microsoft services only. So it is there as a tool to be leveraged for things like Office 365, other cloud-based apps, as well as third-party providers such as Dropbox, SAP, Google, and so on and so forth. So to sum it up, essentially, it is a single point of directory synchronization and management across your cloud stack, whether that is a Microsoft or not Microsoft specific. All right, so if we look at certain things and how can Azure Active Directory assist in closing the gaps with our customers. So one of the things, and there are many features that are available here. If you go to the offering, which we've included with the URL at the bottom of each of the slides, if you go into the web store and you have a look at the offerings, you'll see that a detailed list of features or services are offered between the basic and the advanced feature set. We may not be talking to all of them today through this presentation, but if you have any questions around any of those offerings, please feel free to reach out to us at the distribution list email address. So one of the things that, and one of the most important parts of the offering is conditional access. So essentially, conditional access is where we provide just-in-time access to a user. So it's really understanding who you are, what you're accessing, and where you are located. So an example of this is when trying to access corporate information from an unknown device or a remote region. So as an example, if I reside in Johannesburg in South Africa, and I log in via South Africa or Johannesburg in South Africa, and I then get a security alert to say that somebody's trying to log in with my same credentials from Singapore as an example. This is already known to be an anomaly and something that will get raised as a red flag. And it is through that monitoring and those mechanisms that we understand that there is potentially a breach with using my credentials, and conditional access is one of the ways that we can prevent that by defining certain rule sets in terms of who can access what and from which locations. And further to that, how does this then play into certain behavioral patterns? So if I'm logging on a daily basis from one workstation into certain services, and for some other reason on any point in time I then log into those same services but from a different workstation or a different location, this will get flagged as an anomaly, and conditional access is one of the easiest ways to be able to achieve that. If we look at Azure Active Directory, so Azure Active Directory obviously does have a mechanism to enforce this. So it doesn't necessarily, you don't necessarily have to block access, but you, as that may be a little bit extreme, but you obviously do have the functionality to challenge authentication, again, such as an OTP to the Microsoft Authenticator app via multi-factor authentication, or directly to SMS or phone call or whatever it may be. So that essentially sums up conditional access. So I think, just again to summarize, conditional access is just-in-time access based on certain criteria such as who the person is, what access they need or what data they need access to, and the location of that user. All right, then if we look at password management, so again, how do we ensure that password management is achieved from an organizational level, but owned by the user? And this is quite important. I think traditionally IT administrators were always responsible for password management. If a user ranging from the lowest end of the hierarchy within an organization all the way through to an executive or a chairman level, if that user had to have his password reset or any sort of password management around his accounts had to happen, it would always fall onto the IT administrator. The problem with this is that people are malicious or sometimes do tend to become malicious, and having that level of control to an identity or to a set of credentials, specifically for someone that resides in ExCo or chairman of the board or whatever it may be, poses a serious risk to an organization. And this is where Azure Active Directory plays an important role, where password management is now made the onus of the end user and not the IT administrator. So the way that some of the initiatives that allow us to do this is self-password resets. to start with. So a user would be able to log onto a portal, a self-service portal. So the same way that you'd log onto your Facebook as an example, or any other cloud platform. And if you had forgotten your password, you can click on the forgot password link, and it would go through and it would allow you to reset your password after it validates a couple of security measures. The same principle and process applies to Azure Active Directory, where you go into a portal, you would enter or answer a preset, predefined set of questions. So as an example, what is my mother's maiden name? What is my pet name? Which school did I go to? That type of thing. And important to note that these are customizable as well. And it's just another way that Microsoft is improving their security preventative measures. So by not only allowing or standardizing on a certain preset set of questions, but allowing organizations to be dynamic and setting their own set of security questions, and those could be organization specific or can be completely random. But essentially, once those security questions are answered correctly by the end user, and you can limit that, I think you could start it from 1, and then in variations of 1, 3, and 5, or 5 obviously being the most secure. So once the user enters those, answers those questions successfully on the portal, they'll then have the ability to reset their password. And once their password has been reset, they'll be able to associate that password to all activities. So they'll be able to log into their Office 365, log into their local Outlook, log into any other cloud services and services that they use that set of credentials for with that renewed password. I think another important aspect to this is password management and resetting of passwords is only halfway there. It is very important, specifically for roaming users and users who tend to not be office bound or not to have their devices directly joined to traditional Active Directory, to have the ability to go and reset their passwords via a cloud-based web interface, but then additionally have that password reset synchronized back down to their local Active Directory. And I think this is a big benefit to Azure Active Directory, where that self-password management is the first part of it. And the second part of it is have that password reset synchronized back down to my local Active Directory, so that if ever I had to go back into the office, I would be able to use the same set of credentials and not have to worry about having multiple sets of credentials and trying to remember which sets of credentials I need to use at which location. There are some other mechanisms that this can be done as well. It doesn't just have to be on a security portal. So there could be certain service desks, as an example, that could be configured to phone into the service desk. So this is the traditional way of doing it. You have to phone the service desk. There might be a bit of a delay there. You have to ask them to change your password. There's a delay and a big risk there, which I just spoke about in terms of being malicious. And then obviously they don't necessarily always change your password, and then that may incur additional time where you have to phone back, get the password resets again, and obviously additional risk associated to that as well. So the process of self-password resets, as I mentioned earlier, is the same principle as any cloud-based provider today, any internet banking website where you have the ability as an end user that has access to your own data and the data that you own to go and reset your password in a self-service model without relying on somebody else to do that for you. Okay, then if we look at multi-factor authentication, so I touched on this earlier, but essentially multi-factor authentication is the enforcement of another security layer on top of traditional username and password access. So if I log into any cloud services, really when enabled through Azure Active Directory, I would log onto my Office 365 as an example, whether that's my Outlook application on my laptop, whether it's my Outlook app on my mobile device, or any straight portal access. So if I had to go to portal.office.com, the minute I use my credentials to log into my username and password to log into that portal or that service, I would then get prompted via whichever mechanism I choose to leverage. So one of them is the Microsoft Authenticator mobile app, which essentially resides on your mobile device. So when you try and authenticate, you would get an approval request on your mobile device for you to go and approve. And only once you've approved that, will you be able to then successfully complete your sign-in attempt on your cloud-based service. The same principle applies, as I said, to any Outlook authentication, web-based authentication, in certain instances, full cloud applications or cloud apps authentications as well. That's the one mechanism. There are other mechanisms as well, such as instead of using the the Authenticator app, the Microsoft Authenticator app. You could configure it as administrator on the Azure Active Directory tenant. You could configure it in a way that it would do a phone call to the end user or an SMS to the end user. So in a nutshell, that's really what multi-factor authentication is. And I think it's important to understand that multi-factor authentication doesn't just, it is not only available through Azure Active Directory, but it is also available through Office 365. So they've got a different set of multi-factor authentication initiatives in each of those. And it's important not to burden the user and complicate the user experience process through enabling these security features. There's nothing worse to shut down a very good idea and to prevent these security mechanisms from being implemented other than or by burdening the user and increasing complexity from a user perspective. So when choosing which platform to use multi-factor authentication from, it is advisable that only standardize on Azure Active Directory or on Office 365, but not necessarily on both. Okay, then if we look at role-based administration. So role-based administration is really targeted traditionally at administrators. And this is something that's been, as part of Microsoft's security framework for many years. For those of you that have deployed traditional Active Directory or any other Microsoft products, Exchange or whatever else it may be for that matter, role-based administration, or a form of role-based administration at least, has always been there. So whether I decide to make somebody a part of my domain admins group, or only as a schema administrator for that matter, or only as a printer operator or a remote desktop viewer within Active Directory, that is essentially role-based administration. So it's exactly that. It is allowing certain users to have access to certain things through predefined security roles. Now, Azure Active Directory follows the same principle, and so does all Microsoft Cloud products and all Microsoft on-premise products, where we are able to look at certain roles, and the principle of least privilege always applies. So you should always only grant a user access to on a least privilege basis. So do not give a user full administrative access if he only has to do something, one or two tasks that are orientated or associated to another security role, which doesn't have as advanced security permissions, or that doesn't allow them as much as a full-blown administrator is allowed. So we look within Azure Active Directory and how this applies. So essentially, if you look at the diagram, so we could associate role-based administration to specific users, or importantly, groups. So we always encourage that customers and vendors standardize on security groups as opposed to individual users. And one of the reasons for that is individual users, or it does tend to be a turnaround of individual users. So an individual user may leave the organization, another user may join the organization, and then it just becomes a little bit complex to manage those set of credentials, or those set of users that are allowed access to certain things. And the way that you should control that is by using Active Directory or Azure Active Directory based groups, and rather allow those individual members to be members of or not members of those associated groups. So the same principle applies here, where we have a subscription as an example, and this could be an Office 365 subscription or an Azure subscription, and I choose to only allow certain users, so as an owner as an example on the right hand side, an owner to be the admins group, or I can drill down on that to a lesser extent, or limit the amount of access I want to the administrators group, or another group such as observers, where observers are literally that they only allow, or they only have read-only access allowed into either the subscription or the resource group. So I think the principle here is always use Microsoft's RBAC model, remote-based administration control, or role-based administration control, and allow least privilege to any user that requires any access to any sort of service. Bearing in mind that giving a user full administrative rights doesn't just allow them full administrative rights onto the tenant to go and do certain things, but it also allows them to manipulate and completely bypass that RBAC model, where they could go and add certain other users, again, for malicious natures or not, to the security profile. And it's something that needs to be controlled and managed very carefully. All right, so if we look at certain things just within role-based administration, so if we look at the security principle, that's exactly what I spoke about now. Role definition, so essentially it's the collection of permissions, sometimes just called a role. And that again is, what is this, the people that are associated to this role, what are they allowed to do? So are they a full-blown administrator, or are they only a read operator or a read-only member, as an example? And then the scope part is quite important. And I think that the benefits to a lot of cloud products versus on-premise traditional on-premise products is that cloud products tend to give you a far more granular scope in terms of where you can assign these security roles to. So do I have to assign it at my tenant level? Not a good idea at all. Or can I go and be more granular on it and say that I have a user that requires administrative access, but only for a certain segment of his Azure environment or a certain segment of his Office 365 environment. So an example for this essentially is where, let's say we have a big Azure tenant, and we're doing chargeback and costing models within my Azure tenant to different parts of my business. And I have an IT administrator or a CIO for that matter, who has full administrative access onto the entire tenant. However, I only want certain users, heads of departments as an example, for each of the respective cost centers or departments within Azure to have access to only their segment of that Azure tenant. And that's specifically where role-based administration plays a big role. All right, then if we look at privileged access control, so essentially what is privileged access control? So privileged access control is really, really powerful. It is the process of ensuring that I approve an access request for a specific user or a specific administrator. It's not a foregone conclusion that because I'm an IT administrator, I will have full access. It's more along the lines to say that a user needs to request access, and this could be done via third-party tool sets, such as Beyond Trust or CyberArk, and I know there's some others on the market, but essentially a user will make a request. That request will go through the privileged access system. The privileged access system will pick up a notification. It will say that I have a specific user that is requesting access. And as the IT administrator or the designated authority for the directory services, and in conjunction with those tool sets, would be able to make an informed decision and most importantly, in real time, and only at that point in time, to allow or prohibit access to that environment. So if I'm a user that sits within an IT department and I make a request to make a change to my Azure tenants as an example through privileged access management, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to have that action by default, and it will require the approval and the authorization of someone higher up. So if I can make an analogy to this, it's essentially a chain of command. So you'll follow the process of chain of command and say, I request access, and the next person in that chain of command will be able to say, yes, I grant you access, or no, I don't feel that that is necessary for you to have access to this. So an overview of this is obviously on this slide, yeah? So the user or the employee makes a request through some sort of online form. The request is then reviewed by management or, like I said, a person of authority. The approval is then given. A notification is then sent via email that the approval has either been given or denied, and then the employee performs the certain elevated permissions or actions that they needed to. And then from a monitoring perspective, whoever is associated to Azure Active Directory or whoever is associated to those privileged access systems would be able to provide full monitoring and traceability of certain actions from those privileged access users. And I think the big benefit here is that that granting of privileged access is limited to the session. So once they've made their changes and they disconnect from their session or they sign out from their session, and understanding that certain technologies have an automated timeout period defined to it, once that has happened and they've lapsed that time of authority, they then have to make another request again. So just by granting somebody access through the privileged access mechanism does not mean that they will have access indefinitely. It's limited to that session in time that they have access to. All right. Okay, so then if we look at Azure Active Directory and some of our offerings that we're offering through the IP co-sell opportunity with First Distribution. So these are the different flavors. very much affiliated to the Microsoft licensing as well. So important to understand that we've tried to align. So from a Microsoft perspective, we can take a step back. From a Microsoft perspective, Microsoft are driving consumption of all of their cloud-based products. And through that process, it is the onus resides with us as resellers to ensure that we not only sell the licensing to our customers, but that we drive the consumption of those licensing to those customers as well. And for that reason, when drawing up this offering, we aligned the licensing versions of these offerings to the professional services that are included with those offerings as well. So understanding that all cloud-based products, whether you range from Azure Active Directory, full-blown Azure, Office 365, M365, there are always different options, costing models or SKUs, if you'd like to refer to that. And those SKUs would define what is available within that licensing option and what the limitations are. So this slide, I'm not sure if it's a little bit difficult to read. It's a little bit small, but essentially this slide is a good breakdown to give an understanding of what services, from an offering perspective on the web store, which of those services would be associated to which of these offerings. And you can go through and have a look at these. The important one to note is the multi-factor authentication, again, as I mentioned earlier. So when choosing which of these options you'd like to take to your customer, I highly advise that at a bare minimum for any customer, really. And this is a question that we get quite a lot, is that which customer profile or to which size customers does this or should this offering apply to? And the answer is that there is no way to answer that, really. This applies to absolutely everybody. So whether you have an organization with only 5 users or an organization with 50,000 users, these offerings serve true, and these offerings are applicable to those different customer profiles. And the point behind that is you're protecting data. So there's no ways that we can validate that one customer's data is more important to them than another customer's data. And for that reason, precisely, we encourage that at a bare minimum, at the bare minimum that we propose, Azure Active Directory Premium P1 and P2 to our customers to get the full complement of security features and the features through this offering to those customers, irrespective of the size of those customers. All right, so I think the most important thing from a reseller perspective, because cloud is a rather difficult thing to sell. Everybody knows that they want to be on the cloud because cloud is perhaps a buzzword and it's the next wave within the industry. The problem is that cloud is extremely difficult to justify from a costs perspective. And even as resellers who are well versed in IT and who've been trading and selling IT for many years, it does still tend to be a little bit daunting for an IT service provider to try and motivate or justify cloud to a customer. So for that reason, we've come up with a couple of pre-qualifying or scoping questions. So these essentially are just questions that you could take to your customer to strike a bit of interest and almost plant the seed with them and lead them onto a bigger conversation. So one of the first things is, do you want actionable reports on your organization's identity and access management? So this goes back to what I spoke about earlier, where traditional Active Directory always needed to be bolstered or topped up, if you'd like, with something like AD Manager Plus, where you could get executive level reporting and then technical level reporting on a granular basis for what certain users are doing. So an example of that is, how many users do I have in my Active Directory environment that have their passwords set to not expire, or how many users in my Active Directory environment haven't logged in within the last 90 or 120 days. And Azure Active Directory by default comes out with that granular reporting to allow you to monitor on those examples that I gave now, and a lot more other examples on a very, very granular level. So as an example, how many users have reset their passwords within the last 30 days? How many users have made software changes in the last 30 days? And those are just some of the examples, but essentially the point here is where you could go to your customer and you could offer them a lot more than just traditional reporting through a bolted on service or technology on top of traditional Active Directory. So second question is, do you want users to reset their own passwords? To me, it's a qualifying or a scoping question, but it's something that shouldn't even be debatable. We should be pushing and encouraging our customers to enforce and standardize on the principle that users should own their own accounts, should own their own data, and therefore they should be able to reset their own passwords. So it's just a statistic you can take, use it, don't use it, but essentially a survey was done not so recently or recently where it was unpacked that 25% of all service desk related queries on average globally is associated to password resets. And this just gives you an idea and puts into context how much administrative effort goes into the IT administrator or is expended by the IT administrator in just resetting passwords. And then not just from an IT administrative effort perspective, but how much of global IT is at risk by allowing traditional or level tier 1 or tier 2 remote operators or service desk agents to be able to reset passwords and have direct access and direct impact on a user's set of credentials. Again, whether that user is a traditional user very far down the hierarchy, or whether that user lives all the way at the top as a chairman of a board or a CEO of an organization. So the point of resetting passwords is an absolute must. And the last qualifying question is, do you want your organization's users to log in with multi-factor authentication? Again, it is a question, but it is something that almost needs to start really being enforced. An example of this, and I'm sure many of you may know, is that when renewing your Microsoft competencies now recently, Microsoft would not allow a partner to enroll in the CSP program if multi-factor authentication had not been implemented for the partner's own Azure Active Directory tenants. And that just gives, again, context to how important multi-factor authentication is, but then as well, how big organizations such as Microsoft don't want to be in a position where they are seen to be complicit in any intrusion of identity and access management because they haven't enforced certain mechanisms. And from a service provider perspective and resellers such as ourselves, we need to be going to customers with that same approach and saying that multi-factor authentication is no longer a nice to have, it's an absolute have to have. And for that reason specifically, we can start motivating and justifying Azure Active Directory, even if just at the infancy stage. So I spoke earlier about the different offers and what we offer through the basic and the advanced. So this essentially is the service offering. Important to note here that this is not based on Microsoft licensing. This is based on a services basis, but does then also relate in the back end to certain licensing, which the details of you can get on the web store portal. So the Azure Domain Controller expansion. So this is an optional on both flavors, and the reason for that is that this may not make sense to customers that are cloud-based only. So if a customer has an on-premise Azure Active Directory or Active Directory domain controller, and they want resilience of that domain controller within Azure or offsite, so traditionally businesses would spin up an Active Directory in some of their bigger office sites or their bigger regional offices in conjunction with their head office, and perhaps not so much on their satellite sites. Now, as we move and transition to the world of cloud, we now have options and flexibility of ensuring that options that we can spin up that Active Directory domain controller within Microsoft Azure the same way we would do on a traditional branch office basis. And all that really does is provide resiliency to that domain controller within Microsoft Azure, and understanding that Microsoft Azure is absolutely nothing but an extension of your existing or your client's existing landscape. So it shouldn't be seen as something that's completely disparate. It should really just be seen as another branch office or another head office within the customer site. So for that reason, we've given the option to do the domain controller expansion into Azure. We then standardize on Azure Directory Syncs, as what I spoke about earlier, where we synchronize the identities from our local Active Directory environment through to Microsoft Azure for the purposes of leveraging those sets of credentials for cloud-based services as well as on-premise-based services seamlessly and without disruption to the users. Basic cloud password management, which we spoke about, how do users have the ability to reset their passwords. Company branding, which is pretty much a stock standard and a given. So customers using any sort of cloud-based technology today want to ensure that they provide the same look and feel from a corporate identity perspective to their customers as if it was their own equipment, their own traditional environments. And this is obviously where company branding comes into play. We can still give that same look and feel that it is still my environment, and it really is. Just because we're leveraging a cloud-based environment doesn't mean that the company or the organization doesn't still own that environment, and doesn't still brand that cloud-based environment as their own. And then some of the options that are available on the advanced offering, setup of password write-back, so when the password gets written back to the local Active Directory, self-service group configuration, multi-factor authentication, and identity, Azure Identity Protection for privileged access. All right, so this was really in a nutshell the Azure Active Directory or the AD on Azure offering. There are some other offerings which have been launched but haven't been launched from a marketing perspective yet. So if you'd like to get a sneak preview into these offerings before it gets launched to the public via the web store, you can go have a look, or from a marketing perspective again, you can go and have a look at those URLs or just scan those QR codes in this slide. And then if you're interested in placing an order for these offerings, all these offerings, as I mentioned, are on the web store. So using the URL at the bottom of the slide, you'd be able to go onto the web store and go and choose the option that is best fit for you or your customer. It's a really easy process. And once the order has been placed, we'll get a notification of that, and we will start mobilizing the technical team to get going and do this as a rapid deployment. I think this is an important part about this offering, is that traditional the days of traditional IT projects are diminishing, and the intention of these offerings that we've done in conjunction with First Distribution is to be able to get rapid deployments of these offerings through to customers, but at the same time ensuring that we're driving the consumption, as I mentioned earlier, in line with the licensing procured through these offers. And that's pretty much it. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Chandra. Just very insightful. Do you have any questions that you would like to ask us? So this is a white label service. We have made provision for it on License Central and First for Cloud. You have the ability to order this from First Distribution. It's white labeled through AVeS, and they will assist you in the facilitation of these offers with your customers. And if you have any questions, you can just direct it to us, and we'll take it from there. Thank you so much for your participation. We will share with you the decks, and the recording normally comes in by tomorrow, and then I'll share it with you. Thank you so much, Andre.
Thank you, everyone.